Tonight, we walk through the most beautiful prison ever built. Beijing, the Forbidden City, golden roofs, vermilion walls, 9,000 rooms designed to display power so absolute it claimed to be chosen by heaven itself. Tourists call it magnificent. Historians call it a masterpiece of architecture. But hidden inside those walls was something no guidebook advertises. A punishment so precise, so calculated, that for over 2,000 years it erased women without spilling blood. Imagine being chosen by the emperor. One glance, and your life changes forever. Silk replaces cotton. Servants bow when you enter a room. You carry the future of the dynasty in your womb. And then, one whisper, one rival, one shift in favor, and your name disappears. Your door is locked from the outside. Your coal is withheld in winter. Your water arrives late in summer. Your child is forbidden from seeing you. No trial, no sentence length, no release. They called it the Cold Palace. Not a single building, not a marked location. It could be any room the emperor decided to turn into a tomb for the living. And what happened inside those rooms was not sudden execution. It was slower, more deliberate. Women cried themselves blind. Pregnant concubines starved in corridors between walls. Powerful empresses were sealed behind brick. A reformer who dared to dream of change was thrown into a well that still exists today. For centuries, the empire perfected a system that proved something terrifying. Death ends suffering. Disappearance does not. Tonight, we uncover what Chinese emperors did to their concubines inside the Cold Palace, and why history tried to soften the truth, because the walls are still standing, and they remember everything. The door that swallows names, one night you are chosen, and by morning you are treated like a mistake the empire wants to erase. Behind the brightest walls on earth, a single order can turn silk into prison, and a mother into a ghost. Picture Beijing in the year 1584, when the Forbidden City still felt new enough to intimidate the sky. The roofs were glazed like frozen sunlight. The courtyards swept so clean they looked unreal. And every footstep carried meaning, because everyone inside those walls lived by rank, rumor, and fear. Yet far from the ceremonial halls, beyond the elegant gates tourists dream about, there was a courtyard that smelled of damp wood and old stone. Paint peeled from the pillars. Weeds pushed through cracks no one bothered to repair. The wind moved through the place as if it owned it, and that was the first warning. In the Forbidden City, when the wind is allowed to speak, it means people have been ordered into silence. Her name was Wang, though even that name would soon begin to feel temporary. 6 years earlier, she had been a maid in the Empress Dowager's chambers, a girl with rough hands and lowered eyes, trained to become invisible. She scrubbed floors, folded bed linens, and learned the most dangerous skill a palace servant could learn: how to hear everything without reacting to it. She watched concubines pass like living ornaments, their hair heavy with jade, their sleeves embroidered with dragons that were not theirs, their laughter bright enough to hide panic. Wang understood the law of the inner court. Beauty was a currency, and everyone who held power collected it like tax. Then one afternoon the Wanli emperor walked through his mother's quarters and noticed her. There was no romance in that moment. No soft music history likes to pretend existed. It was a glance from the most powerful man in China, and it landed on her like a sentence. What followed was not a choice. It was a transaction carried out in silence, and the palace recorded it the way it recorded everything: dates, times, chambers, movements. Weeks later, when her stomach began to change, the danger did not come from gossip. It came from the fact that her body now carried proof. When the Empress Dowager confronted her son, he denied it with the ease of a man who believed denial could reshape reality. He did not want Wang. She had no noble family, no banner pedigree, no political value. A maid was supposed to be used and forgotten, but the Empress Dowager produced the logs. The eunuchs had written it down. The system that protected emperors from scandal also trapped him in truth. And so he did the bare minimum. He acknowledged the child and forced a title onto the girl like a rag meant to cover a stain. Consort Gong, a name granted not from affection, but from obligation. Wang gave birth to a son, his firstborn, the kind of birth that should have lifted her into safety. 2,000 years of tradition demanded that the first son mattered. The heir was stability. The heir was heaven's approval. But instead of gratitude, she felt something colder. Because the emperor's heart belonged elsewhere, to a noble consort he had chosen willingly, a woman whose son he wanted on the dragon throne. Wang's child was not a blessing to him. It was a chain. That is why he did something more precise than execution. Executed women become stories. Dead women become warnings. But a forgotten woman becomes nothing at all. He erased her by turning the palace itself against her. He sent her to the farthest corner of the inner city, the Palace of Great Brilliance, an ironic name for a place where light was rationed like mercy. Her silk robes were taken and replaced with plain cotton that scratched her skin. Her jade hairpins vanished. The gold combs her mother had once sent from the provinces were confiscated and never returned. Her monthly allowance was cut. Her charcoal in winter, her water in summer, suddenly became unavailable. The servants who once attended her were reassigned overnight as if she had died. Now she had one attendant, one woman who slid meals through a slot in the door and never met her eyes. She had been ordered not to speak. When Wang begged for news, when she pressed her face to the crack and whispered her son's name like a prayer, the attendant walked away. Footsteps receded, then nothing. Not the normal quiet of a palace at rest, but a silence so complete it filled the room like water and made breathing feel like betrayal. Wang was 19 when the door became her horizon. She did not know that the cold palace was not a single building, not an official prison with a sign above the gate. It was a verdict, a concept, a word spoken by an emperor that could transform any room into a living tomb. And once that word had been spoken, the palace behaved as if she had never existed at all, except for the one cruel detail that made it worse than death. She was still alive to understand the erasure. That night, as the damp walls sweated in the dark, Wang realized the truth the inner court never wrote down. The cold palace does not kill you quickly. It teaches you how to vanish while your heart is still beating. And somewhere beyond those walls, her son was growing taller under orders never to visit the mother who had given him life. Langong, a prison without walls, the cold palace was never marked on a map. It could be your bedroom tonight, and your tomb by morning. Most people imagine the cold palace as a single abandoned structure hidden somewhere in the northeastern corner of the Forbidden City, a lonely courtyard with rusted locks and crumbling tiles. That is comforting, because a single building can be avoided. A single building can be pointed at. But the truth is far more terrifying. The cold palace Langong was not a location. It was a decision. It was a sentence spoken by an emperor that turned any space into exile. A concubine could fall asleep surrounded by silk screens and wake to find the same room transformed into her cage. No ceremony, no trial. Just a shift in rank, and the world around her hardened into stone. The last emperor of China would later admit there was never an official hall labeled Cold Palace. The term floated like a shadow across centuries, attaching itself wherever an unwanted woman was placed. During the Han Dynasty, disgraced palace women were processed through offices that managed female prisoners with bureaucratic efficiency. In the Ming and Qing eras, neglected buildings at the edges of the Imperial complex became sites of erasure. A quiet courtyard behind a garden. A corridor so narrow it was called the Sandwich. A set of chambers that eventually collapsed into rubble because no one deemed them worthy of repair. Different addresses. Same verdict. The genius of the system lay in its simplicity. Execution required paperwork, witnesses, explanation. Banishing a woman required nothing but imperial displeasure. And displeasure could be triggered by anything jealous whispers from a rival, a misplaced glance, a pregnancy that shifted succession politics, a rumor that spread too quickly. One word from the Son of Heaven, and your name disappeared from the registry that determined your existence. Without rank, you had no allocation of coal, no oil for lamps, no scheduled visits from physicians. You were not declared dead. You were simply removed from calculation. Then came the servants. A high-ranking consort once commanded an army of attendants who managed every detail of her life. In the cold palace, she was assigned one servant at most, often none. And the ones sent to these postings were rarely kind. They were eunuchs punished for past offenses, maids resentful of their demotion, people who understood they had been sent to the empire's lowest rung. They knew something else, too. A woman in the cold palace had no protector. No one would discipline them for cruelty. No one would ask questions if food arrived late, or never arrived at all. In fact, some competed for these assignments. It sounds absurd until you understand palace economics. Banished concubines were often once wealthy. They hid jewelry in hems, tucked coins beneath floorboards, hoarded keepsakes no one had discovered yet. A desperate woman will trade anything for warmth, for medicine, for news of a child. A single whispered rumor about the emperor's health could cost a bracelet. An extra bowl of rice could cost a jade pendant. The lowest men in the palace discovered they could profit from someone even lower than themselves. Historical accounts describe attendants who deliberately spilled food before passing it through the door, forcing women to eat what fell to the ground. They withheld coal during the northern winters when temperatures dropped below freezing. They sold rations on the palace black market. They locked doors from the outside and pretended not to hear when voices inside weakened into coughs. Because in Langong, accountability evaporated. You were not worth discipline. The rooms chosen for this sentence were always the worst maintained. Roofs leaked in spring rains. Walls bloomed with mold by autumn. Windows were small, often unlit, because oil and candles were distributed by rank. Without rank, you lived in shadow. Women learned to measure time by the gray square of sky visible through a window, watching it pale at dawn and darken at dusk. That patch of sky became the only clock left. But the cruelest design was not physical. It was psychological. The cold palace had no term limit, no appeal, no annual review. You were there until the emperor remembered you, and emperors rarely admitted error. A woman banished at 20 might spend 40 years staring at the same wall. She would not know if her parents were alive. She would not know if the child taken from her had grown into a man. She would not know if wars had been fought or famines had reshaped the land. The empire continued beyond the walls while she existed in frozen time. Records from multiple dynasties describe the same pattern. Women stopped speaking. They paced identical paths until grooves appeared in stone. They counted bricks, thread by thread, unraveling their own garments just to feel change. Some laughed at nothing. Some screamed in the night, their voices echoing down corridors where no one came. Others simply faded, appetite dissolving as if hunger itself had been erased from memory. Langong was elegant in its cruelty. It did not need chains. It did not need blood. It required only walls, silence, and years. And once you understood that any room could become the cold palace, the entire forbidden city transformed into something else entirely. Not a home of gold and vermilion, but a labyrinth where every doorway held the possibility of disappearance. The cruel math of silence. No chains. No blade. No public execution. Just subtraction of light, of warmth, of voice, until nothing remains but breathing in the dark. Inside the forbidden city, cruelty was rarely loud. It was organized, measured, almost mathematical. The cold palace did not rely on visible violence, because visible violence leaves marks that can be questioned. Instead, It relied on subtraction. First your title was removed, then your stipend, then your servants, then your coal, then your candles. One by one, the small privileges that separated imperial life from survival were stripped away with bureaucratic precision. No announcement followed. The system simply adjusted around your absence, as if recalculating a ledger. Imagine winter in northern China, the kind of winter that cracks wood and freezes ink in its bottle. Coal was rationed according to rank, and rank determined whether you slept in tolerable warmth or in a room that turned your breath into frost. An empress received abundance. A favored consort received enough. A low-ranking concubine barely survived. But a woman in the cold palace had no rank at all, and without rank, there was no coal. She wrapped herself in thin bedding that smelled of damp walls, listening to the wind slip through cracked windows. Fingers stiffened, lips split. Sometimes attendants withheld even coarse cotton garments, ensuring that punishment lingered in every joint. Summer brought no mercy. The same neglected rooms that froze in winter became suffocating chambers of humidity. Mold crept across walls. Mosquitoes bred in stagnant corners. Rats nested in collapsed beams. A fever in the cold palace was not treated with an imperial physician. Physicians served rank. A woman without rank was expected to recover alone. If infection spread, if a cough deepened into something that rattled through bone, no one recorded the stages. One evening food would be pushed through the slot, and the next morning it would remain untouched. By nightfall, a eunuch would enter, wrap the body, and remove it under cover of darkness. The palace administration would note the death the way it noted the disposal of broken porcelain, routine. But the true calculation was time. The cold palace had no sentence length, no release date etched into wood. You were there until the emperor changed his mind, and emperors were taught from birth that heaven did not err. To reverse a decision would imply weakness, so women waited, and waiting altered them more completely than hunger ever could. Within a year, many stopped speaking. There was no one to answer. Words require response to survive. Without it, language decays. Records across dynasties describe similar symptoms. Repetitive pacing until the stone floor bore faint tracks. Counting bricks in the wall again and again as if memorization could prevent forgetting oneself. Pulling threads from clothing until the garment disintegrated, just to watch something transform. Talking to imagined visitors. Laughing at invisible jokes. Screaming in the night when the silence grew too heavy to bear. Silence in the cold palace was not absence of sound. It was pressure. It pressed against the ears until women began to hear things that were not there. Footsteps that never approached. A child's voice that dissolved when they turned their heads. Some stopped eating, not from protest, but because the mind retreated so far inward that hunger felt irrelevant. They faded slowly, like candles left unattended in an empty hall. And there was another unspoken pattern. The wells scattered across the forbidden city. Decorative at first glance, practical for drawing water. Palace records from certain periods quietly note an average of 12 bodies recovered each year. No public mourning, no elaborate rites. Just removal at night and a notation in a ledger that few would ever read. The cold palace offered no doors outward. For some, the only exit was vertical. The youngest documented victim of this system was 14. Married to an elderly emperor who died 3 months later, she bore no child and therefore no political shield. She was sent to a compound reserved for imperial widows, a cold palace by another name. She would remain there for 61 years. 61 winters of rationed warmth. 61 summers of decay. She entered as a child and died an old woman, having lived her entire adult life within walls she was forbidden to leave. This was the cruelty perfected over 2,000 years. Not explosive, not theatrical, efficient. Dead women can become martyrs. Forgotten women become nothing. The cold palace ensured that disappearance felt natural, almost administrative. By the time history looked back, many names had already dissolved. And yet, even within this system of erasure, some stories refused to vanish. Stories where cruelty became so personal, so deliberate, that even official historians struggled to soften it. Stories where power did not merely subtract, it struck. And one of those stories began in the year 655, when 3 women inside the Tang court realized that the cold palace could be transformed into something far worse than silence. The sealed courtyard, 2 rivals who once fought for a throne, now share a prison built without doors. And the woman who placed them there understands one truth: mercy is a weakness history does not reward. The year is 655 AD, during the Tang dynasty, an era celebrated for poetry, prosperity, and imperial elegance. Yet behind the lacquered screens and silk curtains of the inner court, power moved in whispers sharper than swords. Emperor Gaozong sat upon the dragon throne, but inside the palace, influence did not belong only to the man crowned by heaven. It belonged to the women who stood closest to him. Empress Wang had once embodied perfection. Dignified, restrained, politically careful. She ruled the inner court with composure, understanding that survival required obedience dressed as virtue. Consort Zhao was different. Beautiful, charismatic, favored openly by the emperor. She had entered the palace as competition and had never pretended otherwise. For years, the 2 women circled each other like predators forced into shared territory. Every smile was measured. Every gift exchanged between them carried the weight of suspicion. Because in the Forbidden City, affection was temporary, but succession was eternal. Then Wu Zixin returned. She had once been a concubine of the previous emperor, sent to a Buddhist convent when he died, as tradition demanded. She should have faded into religious obscurity. Instead, she came back. She re-entered the palace not as a desperate woman, but as a strategist. She studied her rivals. She understood that ambition in the open is dangerous, but ambition disguised as loyalty is unstoppable. She whispered to Empress Wang about Consort Zhao's arrogance. She whispered to Consort Shao about the empress's insecurity. She presented herself to Emperor Gaozong as reasonable, calm, devoted only to his happiness. And she waited. When the accusations surfaced, they were surgical, poison, conspiracy, betrayal, charges so grave that they demanded swift response. Whether they were true has never been proven. What mattered was that Wu Zixin had already secured enough influence that no one dared question her narrative aloud. Empress Wang and Consort Shao were stripped of their titles. Their silk robes were removed, their names erased from ceremony, and they were sent to the cold palace. But this was not neglect. This was construction. According to Tang records preserved in historical texts, the 2 former rivals were sealed inside a courtyard. Not locked, sealed. The doors were bricked over, the walls heightened. Only a single opening remained just wide enough to pass food through. A hole in stone. That was their connection to the world they had once ruled from behind silk screens. Imagine the transformation. Women who had commanded attendance now sat on bare ground. Women who had competed for an emperor's affection now shared a confined space that offered no privacy, no comfort, no dignity. There were no beds, no furnishings, no change of clothing. They relieved themselves in the same corner where they slept. Rain entered when it wished. Cold entered without resistance. Days blurred into one endless gray. But the cruelest detail was proximity. They had spent years blaming one another for court intrigues. Each convinced the other threatened her survival. Now there was no audience for their resentment, no emperor to impress. Only stone walls and each other. The cold palace had not just erased them, it had forced reflection. Then one day, something unexpected happened. Emperor Gaozong approached the sealed courtyard. Whether guilt stirred in him or curiosity is unclear. He called out their names from beyond the wall. Inside, The women recognized his voice immediately. They wept. They did not demand restoration. They did not curse him. They asked only to see the sky again, to rename their prison the courtyard of reflection, a humble plea suggesting repentance. For a moment, history paused. The emperor reportedly hesitated. He murmured that he would consider their situation. And somewhere else in the palace, Wu Zixin learned of his visit. Her response ensured that hesitation would never occur again. She ordered both women beaten 100 strokes each. A punishment shattered their ability to stand. Then, according to the darker accounts that survived, despite attempts to soften them, she commanded mutilations so severe that later historians described the aftermath in restrained language, as if ink itself recoiled from detail. The two women were placed into large wine vessels and left there. Whether they were conscious when sealed is not recorded. Consort Zhao, in what may have been her final moment of clarity, is said to have uttered a curse. She vowed that in her next life she would return as a cat, and Wu Zixin would return as a mouse, so she could hunt her eternally. The story disturbed even those loyal to Wu Zixin. For years afterward, it is said she refused to allow cats inside the palace. Some scholars argue that later dynasties exaggerated the brutality to tarnish Wu Zixin's legacy, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. Perhaps, but the fact that the story was believable tells its own truth. The cold palace had already conditioned the empire to accept that cruelty inside palace walls required no witness. And Emperor Gazizong? He did nothing. The man whose voice had stirred hope through brick and stone allowed silence to close over the courtyard once more, because by then he understood the law of the Forbidden City. To challenge the one who controls the cold palace is to risk joining those inside it. And the sealed courtyard remained, not as a place of repentance, but as proof that in the palace of Heaven's Son, power did not simply erase women. Sometimes it made examples of them. The corridor between walls, she carried an emperor's child beneath her heart, yet was thrown into a passage too narrow to turn around. In the cold palace, even an unborn heir could be erased without a sound. The Ming dynasty prided itself on order. Ritual manuals governed court behavior. Eunuchs documented movements with obsessive detail. Every robe, every visit, every birth was inked into ledgers meant to preserve imperial continuity. And yet, within this carefully recorded world, cruelty sometimes appeared in its most naked form, written plainly, almost casually, as if it were weather. Her name was Consort Yu. She was young, recently elevated, and most dangerously pregnant. In a palace built on hierarchy and succession, pregnancy was power. An unborn son could shift alliances overnight. A concubine carrying imperial blood suddenly became more than decoration. She became a political variable, and variables threatened those who preferred control. At court, influence did not always sit beside the throne. Sometimes it stood just behind it. During Emperor Tianqi's reign, power pooled in unexpected hands. The eunuch Wei Zhongshan and the emperor's wet nurse, Madame Qi, wielded authority that rivaled ministers. They understood that proximity to the emperor was leverage, and that any woman who bore him a son might disrupt the fragile balance they had constructed. Rumors began quietly, whispers about impropriety, questions about loyalty, accusations without proof, but proof was rarely required inside the inner court. All that was needed was imperial irritation. The emperor, young and pliable, was persuaded. Consort Yu's title was stripped, her allowances revoked, and instead of a secluded courtyard, she was sent somewhere more deliberate. The Sandwich. It was a narrow corridor between two towering palace walls, open only to the sky above. A passage never meant for habitation. In summer, it baked beneath the sun. In winter, it became a wind tunnel that carried northern frost like a blade. There was no roof to shield rain, no hearth for warmth. The stone walls rose so close on either side that turning fully required effort. This was where she was placed. Not locked inside a room, but confined within a channel of stone, visible only to the indifferent sky. Guards ensured she did not leave. Food, when delivered, was insufficient. Records from Ming chronicles state the detail with chilling restraint. She was denied sustenance. No poetry, no euphemism, just absence. Imagine the terror of that space, pregnant, exposed to weather, listening to wind scrape along brick, feeling hunger grow sharper each day while the child within you shifts, unaware of politics, unaware of accusation. The empire that worshipped ancestral continuity allowed an unborn descendant to weaken, inside a corridor barely wide enough for breath. There were no attendants competing for bribes here, no hidden jewelry to barter. The sandwich was not designed for negotiation. It was designed for inevitability. Days passed, then weeks. Starvation does not announce itself dramatically. It arrives slowly. Strength drains from limbs first. Thoughts blur. The body begins consuming itself. For a pregnant woman, the process accelerates. Every calorie divided between survival and gestation. Every heartbeat a calculation. The official record states her end in a single devastating phrase: a corpse and 2 lives. That is how the Ming court recorded it. Not scandal, not tragedy, not outrage. A corpse. 2 lives. No explanation followed. No disciplinary action noted. No inquiry launched. The historian who penned the line moved on to the next entry, because empires do not pause for women they have already erased. But the significance was deeper than a single death. The cold palace had proven something irreversible. It was not merely a place of neglect or isolation. It could become an instrument of targeted elimination, a punishment that left no public spectacle, no formal execution order, no blood on imperial hands. And within the walls of the Forbidden City, everyone understood what had happened, even if no one said it aloud. A concubine carrying an emperor's child had been removed as efficiently as an inconvenient decree. Her pregnancy, once a source of potential power, had transformed into a liability that required correction. The corridor between walls remained. Sunlight continued to strike its stones each morning. Rain continued to fall unopposed. Visitors centuries later would see only architecture, unaware that life once weakened there under open sky. But this was not the final evolution of the cold palace. Because near the end of the Qing dynasty, a different kind of woman would enter its darkness. Not silent, not compliant. A girl who dared to speak of reform, who carried not a child but ideas. And ideas, in a dying empire, could be more dangerous than heirs. The well that still exists, she believed a camera could change an empire. The empire answered with a locked door, and a well no wider than her shoulders. By the late 19th century, the Forbidden City was no longer the confident heart of a rising dynasty. It was a fortress aging in silence. Foreign powers pressed against China's borders. Reformers whispered about modernization. Inside the palace, tradition tightened like a fist. She entered those vermilion gates at 13. History remembers her as Consort San, the Pearl Concubine, young, intelligent, restless. Unlike the other women of the inner court, she did not lower her voice when speaking to the Guangxu emperor. She encouraged him. She challenged him. She believed China could become something stronger if it dared to change. She learned photography, a scandal in itself. Cameras were foreign devices, mechanical eyes that captured reality without ritual permission. She smuggled them into the palace. She photographed court life. Emperors had ruled for centuries through carefully staged portraits and written records. Now a concubine was freezing moments into images that could not be rewritten. For Empress Dowager Cixi, the true power behind the throne, this was more than youthful rebellion. It was threat. Cixi had ruled from behind silk curtains for decades, deposing emperors when necessary, suppressing dissent with surgical precision. She understood one rule above all others. Influence over the emperor was influence over the empire, and Consort Zun had that influence. In 1898, when the Guangxu emperor launched the 100 Days Reform, an ambitious plan to modernize China's government and military, Cixi struck back. The reforms were crushed. The emperor was placed under house arrest on an island within his own palace, and the woman who had encouraged his ambition was sent to the cold palace. Her prison was a small structure in the northeastern corner of the Forbidden City, one of the neglected chambers few visitors ever see. The door was locked from the outside. A single window remained unbarred, wide enough for a tray of food and a basin of water to be pushed through. That was her world. 730 days. 2 years of silence. 2 years of hearing footsteps outside her door that never paused. 2 years of knowing the emperor she loved was confined less than a mile away, equally powerless. She could not send him a message, could not see the sky beyond her narrow window, except as a fragment framed in stone. The cold palace did what it always did. It removed her voice from court discussion. It erased her presence from ceremony. It reduced her to a rumor. Then, in the summer of 1900, chaos reached Beijing. The Eight-Nation Alliance invaded during the Boxer Rebellion. Foreign soldiers advanced toward the capital. The Forbidden City prepared to evacuate. For the first time in 2 years, her door opened. Imagine the shock of sunlight after darkness, the sensation of walking unassisted through corridors that once felt unreachable. Eunuchs led her across courtyards, echoing with urgency. Officials hurried. Servants packed treasures. Cixi was preparing to flee west. Consort Zun was summoned. Accounts differ on the conversation. Some say Cixi claimed the journey would be too dangerous for someone so young and beautiful. Others suggest she feared foreign troops might capture and exploit her. What remains consistent is this: the decision had already been made. Consort Zun did not beg for her own life. Witnesses later claimed she pleaded for the emperor, arguing he should remain in Beijing to negotiate rather than flee. Even in that final moment, she spoke of reform. Cixi's patience ended. The order was given. Eunuchs seized her. She struggled, but the well was close. Behind the Ningxu Palace stood a stone shaft, narrow and unremarkable. Visitors today walk past it without pause. At the time, it was deep enough. She was 24 years old, thrown into darkness once more, this time without walls to contain the fall. Water closed over her. Silence followed. When the court returned months later, Cixi issued a decree praising Consort Zun for her loyalty, claiming she had chosen death rather than burden the fleeing court. The official record held. But the eunuchs who witnessed the event told a different story in private. The well still exists. Tourists photograph it. They see stone. They do not see the 2 years that preceded it, the locked door, the tray of food through a window, a deliberate isolation that made the final act almost predictable. For 2,000 years, the cold palace operated on the same principle. Do not execute if you can erase. Do not create martyrs if you can create silence. Let time accomplish what swords cannot. Consort Gong, who went blind from weeping. Empress Wang and Consort Zhao, sealed behind brick. Consort Yu, starved in a corridor between walls. The 14-year-old widow who spent 61 years mourning inside confinement. Consort Zun, reformer and photographer, thrown into a well because she believed in change. The Forbidden City still stands vast, magnificent, admired by millions. Its halls gleam. Its courtyards echo with footsteps. Yet in its northeastern corners, certain buildings remain closed, unrestored, unstable, structures without tourist value. The cold palace was never a single place. It was a philosophy, a belief that the most complete destruction of a person is not death but disappearance. The stones remember, and now so do you.